I remember sometime in '99, my older brother started talking about this new game called Silent Hill. He wouldn't let me or my younger brother play it. It was too violent, too scary to expose to such young minds. He was probably right to try and keep it away from us. I was just turning 8 years old, but the idea of a video game being too scary was just fascinating to me. How bad could it be? My dad clearly didn't agree that it was inappropriate. He'd make us watch him play it sometimes because he was too scared to play alone. Some of my fondest memories, to be honest. And yeah, it was terrifying. The abrasive sound design, rusty hell textures, and transforming spaces made it feel like you were trapped in a nightmare. But it was more than just frightening, it was lonely, moody, and melancholic. It had this almost numinous quality, an ethereal vibe that I'd only experienced in fantasy before. Little did I know, eh? But think about the riddles near the entrance to the elementary school for a sec. They're written in this anachronistic, poetic way, like the riddles a Dunsanian hero might face when descending into a dank labyrinth. Prophecies, warning of a great and terrible beast that will emerge during our hero's journey. Now, think about how closely the structure of Silent Hill matches that of fantasy action-adventures like Zelda or Alundra. You have the dungeons, which you slowly unlock as you overcome obstacles and solve puzzles, culminating in a boss fight. And then you have the overworld, which expands as you clear those dungeons and acquire more key items. Both cast you as an isolated wanderer in a dangerous and fallen world, guiding your avatar through the ruins of better times which have been laid low by the sins of those who preceded you. The fundamental ludic structure of these games is the same, and the stories and settings have to be arranged to support it. It's a structure that was partly inspired by early CRPGs. Shigeru Miyamoto reluctantly admits that Ultima and the Black Onyx were something of an influence on The Legend of Zelda's design, which I reluctantly admit has been something of an influence on a lot of things. The American action-adventure genre emerged quite separately from the Japanese one, but the two have much in common owing to their similar roots. Warren Robinette's legendary adventure for the Atari 2600 was conceived as a graphical implementation of William Crowther's Colossal Cave adventure, which was, in turn, inspired by a cocktail of Crowther's caving hobby, fantasy literature, and D&D. D&D was a mega hit, and almost as soon as it landed, bored programmers at universities across America began the satanic work of bringing it to the computer. Both the adventure and computer role-playing genres emerged from these attempts. As a result, early game journals often spoke of the two as one. These were the long-form games, the story games, the adventure games, and while each side focused on different aspects of the D&D experience, there was a lot of shared DNA between them. The earliest CRPGs started to emerge around 1974 or 1975. They're focused on the navigation, combat, and resource management parts of the dungeon crawl experience, testing your discretion and planning as you traverse their mazes. They also tended to have treasure-centric character development just like the old-school versions of Dungeons & Dragons. The earliest unambiguous home computer RPG is Don Worth's Beneath Apple Manor for the Apple II in 1978. Which is sometimes also considered the earliest roguelike, though it obviously predates Rogue by 2 whole years. It has a fairly unique attribute system, where each attribute is a resource that you can spend in addition to something that influences like hit chance or damage or what have you. Attacking drains your strength, magic drains your intelligence, getting shanked drains your body, etc, etc. You can use a turn to wait at any time to recover some of your statistics, but body can only be restored by either leaving the dungeon or using magic. You'll be leaving the dungeon a lot anyway to develop your attributes, and it's also the only way to get a brain scan so you can carry on where you left off statistically, if you get mullered. Treasure is, of course, a much more efficient way to gain experience than killing monsters is. Just like the original D&D, you're rewarded 1 experience point per gold piece, and monsters can be incredibly dangerous, so it's better to avoid them when you can and fight cleverly when you can't. Some enemies are even impossible to meaningfully fight until you have the appropriate equipment, and there's a dedicated run button, which lets you quickly escape combat provided you're not cornered, giving the game a strong survival horror aspect. You can even listen at doors to better prepare for what lies ahead. The game is more a test of your discretion than your tactical acumen, quite different from most modern dungeon crawlers. By the time iconic CRPGs like Wizardry started coming out, more of your experience points were earned by acquiring victims than by acquiring treasure, but the tactics of individual combat still mattered less than how well you managed your supplies. Knowing when to use your items and spells and when to retreat and rest was key to your success. Early adventure games, however, very rarely had formal combat systems or character progression at all. Most were about exploring a limited space which expands as you examine the environment, pick up key items, and use them to overcome obstacles. Some games, like Le Crime du Parking or the Potopia serial murder case, are much more about uncovering clues by exploring an environment and talking to people, and still others, like Passengers on the Wind or Mirrors, are much more passive experiences altogether. But most of the very earliest games were taking the problem-solving aspect of the D&D dungeon crawl and digitizing it. Add some spooks, some guns, and some enemies to point them at, and you have survival horror. Though predated by Peter Langston's Wonder, it was William Crowther's aforementioned Colossal Cave adventure that progenited the adventure game genre. The game is even the genre's namesake. Before the Colossal Cave retronym was applied, it could be found deep in the bowels of your local university mainframe as simply adventure. The version that most people are familiar with was greatly modified and expanded by Don Wood in 1977, who got the source code after emailing Crowther's name at every ARPANET site. With Wood's contributions, what had been a fairly grounded caving game inspired by fantasy became a fantasy adventure outright. Like many classics of the fantasy short story, there weren't very many people to talk to in Colossal Cave. You were, for the most part, utterly alone. It strongly resembles classic adventures like The Fortress Unvanquishable Safe as Saknoth, Tower of the Elephant, or The Tale of Sir Tamprazyros, which similarly feature isolated adventurers in dangerous situations on the hunt for treasure, sometimes solving riddles and overcoming savage beasts as they go. Well, okay, The Fortress Unvanquishable is kind of about saving the world, but the other two are about treasure. The twin genres influenced each other greatly, RPGs in particular becoming much more adventure-like as the 80s wore on and they adopted more event-driven narratives and puzzles and such. Even some older games straddled a line, like Zork incorporating a D&D-like combat system, or MUDs all being built around text parsers. As a result, once devs started incorporating action gameplay into their adventures and RPGs, the resulting hybrid genres wound up with a ton of crossover. Survival horror comes primarily from the action-adventure lineage, and just as we can see clear similarities between games like Zelda and action RPGs like Ys, we can easily draw comparisons between survival horror games like Resident Evil and horror-themed dungeon-crawling RPGs like Elvira Mistress of the Dark. The core concepts are fundamentally the same: isolated protagonists exploring labyrinthine locations, avoiding traps, solving puzzles, and battling or escaping monsters whilst managing scarce resources. This is how most people define the survival horror genre, but you can see these elements in other types of RPG and adventure games too. It's Ecstatica and Ronin Blade, it's War of the Dead and Metal Gear, it's La Place No More and Wizardry. The things that differentiate survival horror from its ludic peers are largely in its primary themes and presentation. But gameplay tells stories too, and all of these games share a common lineage thanks to the enormous influence of Dungeons & Dragons and modern genre fiction's common ancestry in the Gothic. Fantasy and supernatural horror have always been closely related through their shared parentage in the Gothic, both drawing on strange cults, black magic, and the restless dead for their stories. Gothic scholar Albert Power identifies Thomas Leyland's 1762 novel Longsword, labelled an historic romance by its author, as a precursor to, or cornerstone of, the Gothic novel, and described it the following way.
The greater part of what would come to be accepted as the conventional trappings of the Gothic are all present. A medieval setting, themes of dastardly deeds matched by selfless heroism, settings of gloomy, wind-blown castles and monasteries, the fires of lust ignited to precipitous extremes of peril, the steady valor of feminine virtue, and the all but obligatory, roguish minister of religion.
Now, Gothic stories are not always set within the medieval period, but the medieval remains core to it regardless. The genre is named for the architectural style, popular in the Middle Ages, and pejoratively called Gothic by pricks during the Renaissance to denote its supposed barbarism compared with the beauty of classical antiquity, the Goths being the people what sacked Rome and all. Gothic fiction was part of the broader cultural movement of Romanticism and was born out of a backwards-looking cultural tendency, both haunted by and nostalgic for Europe's medieval past. Most people are aware that the Gothic is where the modern supernatural horror story comes from. Even if they've never heard of the Castle of Otranto or whatever, they're usually at least aware of 19th century classics like Dracula. But the same romantic medievalism that inspired the Gothic's grand castles, old manners, and macabre superstitions also inspired writers like William Morris and Lord Dunsany to try and revive the old mythic sagas and chivalric romances, creating the genre of fantasy in the process. The supernatural terrors that characterize the Gothic, the ghosts, the vampires, the werewolves, are drawn from the same folk tales and superstitions that provided the background for these romances and remain staples of both the Gothic horror and fantasy genres to this day. Many early fantasists were prolific writers of ghost stories too, drawing on the same medieval imagery and stylistic moodiness whichever genre they were writing in. An important aspect of the Gothic, inherited by horror and fantasy both, is the theme of the past intruding upon the present. For an especially obvious expression of this, think about how many classics of Gothic literature contain epistolary elements, or are presented as part of a diary or recently unearthed historical text. Even Gothic stories that are presented with a more conventional omniscient narrator frequently place our characters alone in isolated locales, with the diaries in the drawers, paintings on the walls, and letters of lost lovers being what drives the story forward. Now think about that oh-so-common survival horror trope where the narrative is primarily conveyed through the ruined environment, diary entries, item descriptions, scattered notes, and newspaper clippings. And then, maybe, think about how many fantasy works, including frequently D&D, are set in fallen worlds, amongst the ruins of a nobler age where the world building is filled out by the lore of those elden times. In fantasy games, this is often expressed the same way as it is in their survival horror cousins. Old ruins, rotting diaries, and item descriptions provide essential historical context for the dramas in which you're participating, an expression of this past haunting the present idea at the core of the Gothic. The Gothic is all over video games, not just those in the fantasy and horror genres. There's actually a bunch of really great writing out there about this already, encapsulated by this quote from the introduction of video games in the Gothic by Ewan Kirkland.
Game designers working across different series, cycles, and genres have incorporated Dungeons & Dragons, neo-medieval fantasy, spooky houses, dark industrial spaces, detective protagonists, and narratives of traumatic pasts into their work. The prominence of these tropes, all traceable back to traditions within Gothic fiction, shows how the Gothic mode suits the particular requirements of the video game format.
But while individual games take obvious aesthetic and plot inspiration directly from the Goth classics, I'd argue that it's by way of 20th century fantasy fiction that the Gothic has exerted the greatest direct influence on game design. The Gothic mode suits the needs of the video game format precisely because the video game format owes so much to Dungeons & Dragons. The original edition of D&D, 0th edition, defined a game loop that hardly transformed at all in the transition to digital games. It's one that still sits at the heart of the action-adventure-derived survival horror genre to this day. You see, original Dungeons & Dragons is a little less focused on balanced tactical combat than more modern iterations of the game. It's still about combat, to be sure. Often the best way to acquire treasure, and therefore experience points, is to eliminate its guardian, but the game is testing your discretion much more than it's testing your mastery of its moveset. It's the difference between Devil May Cry and Resident Evil, right? Both have you trapped in a spooky house filled with monsters, and both of them require you to defeat those monsters in combat. But Devil May Cry is primarily concerned about your mad skills, where Resident Evil is primarily concerned about your ability to plan ahead and pick your battles. Original D&D is a game where a single attack can goddamn end you. And resources are often very scarce too. Take spell slots for example. Not only do you get fewer of them than you do in modern editions, but they store spells like items. If you have 2 first level spell slots, and you put sleep in one and magic missile in the other, you can't cast sleep twice. It's much closer to the magic system in Jack Vance's Dying Earth series, where spells have a certain weight in the user's brain and are forgotten as soon as they're cast. The whole single-character role-playing aspect was rooted in David Wesley's Brownstein games, a Napoleonic campaign set in the titular town where each player controlled a single character each. Wesley found that his players were content to act out their roles, and hardly participated in any warring at all. This inspired Dave Arneson's later Blackmore games, where he transported the Braunstein model to an imagined medieval world. He'd grown tired of the stiff simulationism of his wargame campaigns, and wanted to run something with more of a narrative focus, something inspired by the imaginative fiction he loved so dearly. Gygax, himself a lifelong fan of fantasy fiction, was extremely excited by Arneson's game, and the two began to collaborate on what would become D&D. They drew from a variety of genre authors in an attempt to build a system where the events of classic pulp adventure stories can emerge naturally as a result of the game's mechanics. It was simulating adventure fiction the way its wargame parents simulated historical battle. Now, when I say wargames, your mind might go to something like Warhammer, 2 or more players controlling vast armies of lovingly painted miniatures, competing to see who has the superior tactical mind. And while that's entirely accurate, it's also incomplete. Wargames started out as a form of military training before becoming a hobby primarily enjoyed by suspicious history nerds. They modeled troop morale, terrain, supplies, and even climate sometimes. Logistic stuff. Your ability to manage your resources in the face of endless attrition is just as critical to victory as your knowledge of skirmish tactics. And what like in a real war? The dungeon of original Dungeons & Dragons is organised similarly to a battle in a war game, but with an eye to Grey Mouser stories instead of historical conflict, with mechanics for tracking food and light as you navigate the dungeon, and strict limitations on what your characters are able to do in a 10-minute time frame, even outside of combat. Original D&D was reaching for the tools that existed at the time to simulate the fiction which inspired it. As a result, any game whose mechanics are derived from D&D's core carry the DNA of that adventure fiction somewhere within them, even when their aesthetic elements are drawing from more stereotypically gothic works. Look at Crystalware's House of Usher from 1980, for example. It's a very early arcade adventure, action-adventure thingy from before those terms were properly defined, and is based on the similarly named Edgar Allan Poe story. It takes the slow-burn, monsterless horror of its source material and turns it into a dungeon crawl, a hunt for treasure, blood, or answers while racing against the clock. The original story themes its conclusion around the telling of an old chivalric romance, wherein a valiant knight does combat with a terrible beast. But none of the story's actual characters engage in any actual combat. The horror is entirely psychological. From a modern perspective, the game feels like a very primitive survival horror. It has the horror iconography, the jump scares, the resource scarcity, the inventory limits, and the restricted but explorable game world. Yet within the context of its time, its clear contemporaries are games like Rogue and Adventure, graphical games about exploring a place, acquiring stuff, and slaying monsters. A hero wandering into an abandoned old dwelling, searching for riches and murking bitches. It's an early example of how, through D&D, the adventure aspect of the Gothic shines through in video games, and this remained true even as the medium's stories became more sophisticated. I mean, Heather Mason kills a god with a melee weapon if you're not a coward. There's no puzzle to it, no special item, no ritual you gotta perform. You just hit the thing till it runs out of hit points. Ripley's a bad bitch for sure, but Heather's on another level. She's on some Red Sonja shit. She has descended into the underworld, traversed labyrinths, fought demons, solved devious riddles, and in the process acquired power. She has learned that she is special, gifted, and magical, and her journey ends when she confronts the Almighty and triumphs, steel pipe in hand. The only thing you would need to do to turn it into a pulp fantasy masterpiece is change the setting, change some nouns, that's it. The events of the story wouldn't need to be touched at all to reframe it as a weird fantasy epic. In fact, the fantasy stories published by Weird Tales were the first fiction I found to capture the specific feeling of melancholy horror that Silent Hill gave me a craving for in the first place, and Black God's Kiss by C.L. Moore was the one. Jarell of Jouari descends into hell to seek a weapon cruel enough to enact her vengeance, but soon finds that neither her sword arm nor her steel will can truly hold in the face of such eldritch dooms. At one point, she encounters a herd of unfamiliar beasts travelling across the underworld's ethereal landscape, and finds herself moved to tears by their strange melancholies. It's such an oddly poignant moment. Jarell has a sensitivity and an emotional maturity which is uncommon amongst pulp heroes. Her stories are far more introspective than many of her contemporaries were, with much of the plot being communicated through her thoughts and feelings as much as by physical action. She's not just Conan with tits. For as dark and numinous as Conan can get, Jarell's stories are of a much more somber and psychological breed. all the melancholy of Dunsany and cosmic pessimism of Lovecraft married within the soul of a character who has real emotional depth. The second story, Black God's Shadow, even has direct thematic parallels to Silent Hill 2. Both are variations on the myth of Orpheus, in which the protagonist descends into the underworld to reunite with their own murder victim. Stories in which the protagonist's transgressions are literalized and turned into the very monsters they must destroy. Jurel of Joiry is as much a horror story as Silent Hill 2. Neither is directly related to the other, but they both exist at the intersection of fantasy and horror created by their shared history within the Gothic. One is a part of the lineage which birthed Dungeons & Dragons, the other of the lineage birthed by it. Silent Hill 2 is a gothic tale of guilt and grief, violence and its excuses, wherein each of the game's characters confronts and is confronted by their own guilty conscience, represented in gameplay by the world's mightiest pipe samurai beating his inner demons to death. The town of Silent Hill is a screaming hell, and within it James creates his own Satan, a tempter and accuser who tests his morality as he descends, like Orpheus, into the underworld to recover his beloved who he, like Jurel of Joiry, murdered with his own hands. The needs of its action-adventure-derived gameplay turn the story into a quest, a story of a tormented man thrust into a mysterious and magical world on a journey of self-discovery, traversing otherworldly labyrinths, solving riddles, and overcoming nightmarish beasts through wit and force of arms. Like Silent Hill 3, its fantasy lineage is easy to discuss because, despite the lack of any direct influence on the part of the developers, its supernatural elements grant it a surface-level proximity. But it isn't just Silent Hill. The entire survival horror genre can be traced back through a lineage of RPG and adventure games that lead back to D&D and the pulp heroics at the root of its mechanics. Resident Evil is by no stretch a fantasy story, and yet it is still a story wherein a party of trained combatants become trapped in a mysterious gothic manor and are forced to defeat strange monsters and solve stranger riddles, all while dodging traps and building up their arsenal. There are horror stories like this in other mediums, of course. Part of what I want to communicate here is the fluidity of genre when it comes to story composition and structure, but the frequency of the monsters and the sheer martial prowess the heroes display in fair combat is unusual even in the zombie genre, and it is because of the huge influence of the dungeon crawl on the genre's fundamental ludic makeup. Survival horror is a term coined by Capcom to describe Resident Evil in 1996, the first scary video game to be a global mainstream hit. It was then adopted by players and the press to describe the veritable army of inspired buys that were released in the wake of its tremendous success. Therefore, any game released prior to Resident Evil can only be called the first survival horror game retroactively, granted historic significance by Resident Evil's later role in defining the genre. There are other types of horror game, to be sure, and the term survival horror has been used broadly and inconsistently over the years, but when I use the term, I am talking specifically about horror games in the Resident Evil style. Resident Evil takes elements from adventure games, with its fairly linear narrative, cinematic camera angles, traps, and lock and key puzzles. On top of all that are simple combat and resource management mechanics which force you to contend with a brutally limited carrying capacity wherein key items take up the same slots as weapons and ammunition. Fighting is the best or only way to progress, just as often as it's a total waste of resources. Resident Evil, unlike most action games of its time, tests your discretion much more than it tests your reflexes, in a way that mirrors the early days of the dungeon game. There are two key figures in Resident Evil's development team whose influences take us on a dungeon crawling journey. First is producer Tokuro Fujiwara, who directed the Famicom RPG Sweet Home in the late 1980s and started the Resident Evil project as a way to fully realize his vision of a scary video game. Second is scenario designer Kenichi Iwao, who points to his favorite game Alone in the Dark, the classic action-adventure title Alcazar the Forgotten Fortress, and the fighting fantasy series of role-playing game books as key influences. Sweet Home is loosely based on the movie of the same name. According to Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of Resident Evil, Fujiwara had wanted to try making a horror game for a while, believing it could become an established video game genre of its own. He was broadly pleased with the work he and his team had done, but felt that the limited technology of the Famicom, and even a generation of consoles that followed it, restricted what could be done with the horror genre, and it wasn't until the PlayStation came along that he decided it was time to revisit Sweet Home's ideas. By then, he was in a very senior position at the company, and was handing off directorial duties to young up-and-comers like Shinji Mikami to assist in their professional development. Sweet Home is a dungeon crawling RPG. You control a party of weaklings through a mess of corridors and random encounters while trying to keep their intestines inside. There are puzzles to solve, rooms to explore, dialogues to read, and, unlike the movie, monsters to slay. It uses an old-school inventory system, presented like Dragon Quest, where each character has their own separate inventory with a highly limited number of slots, strictly limiting how much stuff you can keep with you. In terms of structure and presentation, it feels very much like an 8-bit Resident Evil. It even has the door opening animation. The main differentiating factor is its wizardry-esque combat, but really, that just makes it feel like an ancestor to the later survival horror dungeon crawls like Pudelka. Now, according to Kenichi Iwao in interviews with Gaming.moe and CrimsonHead.com, the resource scarcity, labyrinthine world design, and enemy behaviors largely come from Alcazar, the Forgotten Fortress, a 1985 action-adventure by Tom Lowry with graphics by Kerry Longaway. Originally published by Activision for the Coleco Adam computer, Alcazar massively expands on the concepts seen in earlier American action-adventure games like Adventure and House of Usher. Your goal is to make your way across the world map, infiltrating castles, and commandeering their stuff until you make it to the titular fortress on the other side of the screen. You only have 3 inventory slots, forcing you to make a lot of difficult decisions. Do you take the rope so that you can cross the chasm on the world map? The water in case you're ambushed by a genie? Or the keys so you can rescue prisoners for extra lives? All of these take up the same inventory slots that your ammo does, so you really have to think about what to carry and when. It even features many of the same tension-building presentation tricks as Resident Evil, using audio and environmental cues to warn you about nearby monsters before you encounter them. And that's good because it's best to avoid the game's enemies whenever possible. The sound of your gun can be heard from any adjacent rooms, and monsters can take a lot of punishment before they go down. But they're persistent too, chasing you from room to room, and some monsters even carry valuable items like keys, potentially forcing your hand. The game very much feels like an expansion on the concept seen in Lowry's earlier Intellivision game, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons: The Treasure of Tarmin. In an interview with Intellivisionaries back in 2014, Lowry talks about some of his frustrations working on Tarmin due to the restrictions of the hardware. He talks about the game's dependence on character development, its grid-bound movement and combat, and its lack of any outdoor world connecting disparate dungeons. Alcazar feels to me as though it's inspired by some of these grievances. It is, like Tarmin, a dungeon crawling game about acquiring gear in randomly generated mazes, but it has outdoor exploration, much more involved real-time combat, and enemies that behave somewhat intelligently, resulting in a much more dynamic sort of game. I couldn't reach Lowry to confirm, but I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that Alcazar is likely expanding on his prior work. Fighting Fantasy is a series of solo pen-and-paper role-playing games complete with stat-based character generation and dice-driven combat against foul monsters in the depths of the underworld. Most of the books were pulpy fantasy stories of the heroic variety, morbid tales of warriors coming face-to-face with devious sorcerers and impossible monsters in the dungeons of haunted castles. Several books, though, eschewed the sorcery and swords altogether for more of a pure horror experience, which cast you as a hapless fool merely trying to survive the night. In the iconic House of Hell, the specific game which Iwao was lifting inspiration from, you're provided with fewer resources than normal and have a fear statistic that works as a secondary health pool, but it's otherwise very much in line with its fantasy brethren. Its mansion setting is just another variation on the gothic motif common in fantasy, and it's still full of nasty ghouls for you to shank all the same. The series already encouraged caution and resource management, was already built to create tension through highly lethal game design and evocative descriptions of terrible monsters. It was largely the tone that influenced Iwao, and the particular narrative scenarios that emerged across the course of play, but the resemblance to Resident Evil is pretty undeniable. Now, as for Alone in the Dark, Iwao insists that it was a consistent reference point for the Resident Evil development team, even calling out people who say otherwise. Shinji Mikami admits it was instrumental in changing the direction of the project, being the principal inspiration for Resident Evil's iconic fixed camera angles and static background images. Now, Alone in the Dark was originally pitched by Infogrames as an adaptation of the Call of Cthulhu RPG, and while Frederick Reynold, the director, was excited to get the opportunity to make a horror game, he didn't actually like Call of Cthulhu very much.
Playing a lot of role-playing game also with my friend at this time, and especially Dungeons and Dragons. I played a little bit Call of Cthulhu because actually I didn't like it. The character sheet was so huge and it was so difficult.
I'm not sure it would have changed much though. Call of Cthulhu is still a game where players are frequently trapped in hostile, isolated locations filled with monsters and traps. Hell, D&D's literary inspirations aren't even that far off. Several mythos writers are listed as influences. It was a game about weird fiction as much as straight fantasy. Alone in the Dark Age, like the survival horror games that followed, horror fiction by way of adventure fiction, transformed into a more action-packed and heroic scenario by the needs of its gameplay genre. Riddles, monsters, traps, all must be overcome on your quest to defeat an evil pirate wizard and prevent the apocalypse. I don't mean to imply that these games aren't horror fiction, or that they aren't scary. Survival horror is more than just horror wrapping, as some would call it. It's a type of horror that exists in the liminal space between genres, where the legends of the Gothic and the Pulp eras live, where the authors of Appendix N live. When Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st edition came out in 1979, Gary Gygax included a huge list of suggested reading material outlining some of the works and authors which helped to inspire the design of the game. We got classic writers like A. Merritt, De Camp, Vance, Lieber, Lovecraft, Derleth, and even Tolkien despite Gygax's protestations, and the lawsuit. There's tons of horror here in addition to the expected fantasy and adventure stories, and almost all of these authors tend towards a macabre, gothic tone. Even Conan, the most iconic superheroic character in the pulp fantasy canon, was frequently beset by terrors beyond his comprehension in the original short stories. He runs into an honest-to-God space alien in Tower of the Elephant, a story which also comes pretty close to an early 5-room dungeon if you swap the order of the rooms around a little. Perfect adventure game fodder too. Every problem in the story is solved like an inventory puzzle. The Garden of Lions is overcome by using the Black Lotus gas, the Spider is overcome by using the treasure chest, and Sorcerer Yara is overcome by using the Orb of Yag Kosha. This was a really common way for these stories to go. They took from the old heroic myths and chivalric romances, where the adventure would test the hero's cleverness and wisdom in addition to their strengths. It's also reflected in the design of D&D adventures like Tomb of Horrors or Castle Amber, where wit, guile, and judicious use of special items to overcome traps and puzzles is the order of the day. Adventures where combat against deadly monsters is significantly downplayed, if not non-existent. Howard's Conan stories, alongside Clark Ashton Smith's fantastical Hyperborean cycle, existed as part of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, and all three of them drew inspiration from similar sources, principally the Gothic movement and the ghost stories and fantasy tales which followed. Lovecraft wrote a lot of Dunsanian fantasy during his lifetime, and even his more famous horror stories fit into a certain expression of the genre. Stories like At the Mountains of Madness are, after all, following a doomed party poking through the monster-haunted remains of a nameless civilization, like geeky pathetic reincarnations of Conan. How is that any different to Smith's The Tale of Sir Tampra Zyros? A fantasy story in which two petty thieves trek across miles of jungle to loot the remains of a long-dead kingdom before encountering the indefatigable guardian of its long-absent god. All that separates them is setting, a forgotten Iron Age civilization in Smith's case, and a fantasized version of the 20s and 30s in Lovecraft's. All the early pulp weird fiction authors were writing gothic tales of dungeons and demons and the mortals who would disturb them, whether they were set in 17th century France, 20th century Antarctica, or in mysterious alien worlds. Weird fantasy and weird horror were separated by the aesthetics of their setting much more than by the structure or content of their stories. The fantasy stories in Appendix N were also horror stories, as often as not. One Appendix N writer stands out to me in particular, Margaret St. Clair. She was one of the prouder pulp writers, championing the ability of pulp fiction to reach and be reached by ordinary folks. She went on to write 8 novels in her lifetime, the most famous of which was one of D&D's listed inspirations, Sign of the Labyrinth, a Wicca-themed post-apocalyptic science fantasy story that takes place in an underground shelter where survivors live in fearful isolation from one another in the aftermath of a
devastating yeast plague.
Sam Sewell descends into the restricted lower floors of his bunker in search of a witch who has been calling him. The first few floors are pretty normal, but as he gets deeper, the exits become more and more well hidden, the traps more devious, the environment more surreal and dangerous. It is the D&D dungeon structure down to a T. Of course, Sam is not helpless, and he develops a number of special magical powers as he descends the labyrinth. literally leveling up as his adventure progresses, yet the story maintains a sense of dread and uneasy mood that it gives way to a lot of high-strung tension and disturbing imagery. The composition of Sign of the Labyrinth's story, where each floor represents a new and escalating challenge for the hero, has obvious parallels to D&D, but its slow burn tension and ordinary protagonists bring to mind many classics of the survival horror genre as well. It's a very gamey feeling novel, an exceptionally well executed version of the sort of web horror you sometimes come across that's obviously somebody's dream video game plot squeezed into the medium of the written word. Not that Labyrinth feels compromised in any way, it's a good book. It's just composed very gamily, with each floor of the dungeon comprising a new and distinct narrative episode, the power progression of the hero, the lone exploration through an empty, dangerous environment. It's all video game stuff. It would be trivial to adapt it into a tabletop campaign or a video game, and it's precisely because it had such a tremendous influence on D&D that it feels this way. D&D owes a lot to this novel, and D&D's influence on video games, especially adventure games and RPGs and all that is derived from them, is very difficult to overstate. D&D's dedication to simulating the fiction its authors loved mean that these stories are still swimming around in the medium's DNA to this day. It's hard to crawl a dungeon without hearing the cry of Conan somewhere inside. Now, I acknowledge that the influence of all of this on the survival horror genre seems very indirect. Team Silent weren't referencing C. Elmore, Capcom weren't referencing Robert E. Howard, and Team Ninja weren't referencing fucking Fritz Lieber. They're in influences, and you can always go back further if you want. You could keep going and talk about how survival horror is reducible to the core elements of the Sumerian myths if you wanted to, but that would be reductive, right? It removes the element of human experience, the part where the Miyamotos and Crowthers of the world were inspired by real-life beauty and not just other media. It removes the plurality of influences that go into any creative pursuit. It removes the truly unique spark that each individual creative brings to the table. But these elements are not only present in the survival horror genre indirectly. The dungeon crawl is the foundational ludic structure that the whole genre is built on, and that structure was made with certain narrative outcomes in mind. Even in the 80s, there were horror stories in the medium that did not use the dungeon format, but survival horror does. It's what makes it a genre and not just a term we use for horror game. It would be ridiculous to say that survival horror, or any video game that shares the dungeon format, is only a result of D&D and its influences. They're just a part of the foundation upon which each new artist builds. Alone in the Dark includes D&D, it includes Smith, it even includes Lovecraft, but it is overall a particular mix of filmic, literary, and lived experiences coming from multiple people over multiple years who transformed the dungeon format into something new, something a little different to anything we'd seen before. But it remains an adventure story, a journey through a dark and perilous dungeon, and you'll always hear the clash of swordsmen and sorcerers echoing in the corridors of such places.